The text came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I almost didn't see it. I was already half asleep in the armchair, the television mumbling weather forecasts at the wall, a glass of water sweating rings into the side table. My phone lit up, that cold blue rectangle of light, and I reached for it out of habit, the way old men reach for things that used to matter. "Dad, I found something. I'll explain everything tomorrow, don't worry." I stared at those 20 words for a long time. Daniel, my son Daniel, who worked 3 counties over at an environmental research firm, who called every Sunday without fail, who still addressed birthday cards to me with the formal precision he'd learned as a boy, "Dear Father, always dear Father." I read the message twice. Then I set the phone down, told myself not to worry the way he'd asked, and went to bed. He never called the next day. He never called again. In the first week, I filed a missing persons report. The officer who took it, a young woman with the patient eyes of someone who'd heard every version of this story, told me that adults disappear voluntarily more often than people think. That Daniel was 29 years old. That there was no evidence of foul play. She said these things gently, as if gentleness could substitute for answers. I drove home and sat in my kitchen until dark. His apartment held no clues, the police said. His car was found at a trailhead 40 miles from town, keys in the cup holder, a water bottle on the passenger seat. The trail led into a state forest. Search teams went in 3 times over 2 weeks. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a wrapper, not a single thread. His colleagues at the firm, a small environmental consulting company called Verdant Sciences, said Daniel had been working on a water quality study for a rural county. Routine stuff. Soil samples, runoff analysis, the slow bureaucratic science of making sure people's tap water didn't kill them. His supervisor, a lean, distracted man named Greer, said Daniel had seemed excited in his last few days. Unusually so. Like he was onto something, Greer said, then caught himself, as if that phrase carried weight he hadn't intended. I asked what he meant. Greer looked at the floor. "He just seemed energized," he said. "You know how researchers get." I didn't know. Daniel had never been excitable. He was careful, methodical, the kind of man who double-checked his math and triple-checked his sources. Energized wasn't a word I associated with my son. Steady was. Reliable was. Daniel was the man who showed up early and stayed late and never, not once in his life, disappeared. The first year was the worst, in the way that first years always are, not because the pain is sharpest, but because hope is still alive inside it, gasping. Every time my phone buzzed, my chest performed a small, terrible lurch. Every unfamiliar car on my street made me stand up from whatever I was doing and go to the window. I kept his number in my contacts. I called it sometimes, late at night, just to hear his voicemail. "You've reached Daniel Marsh. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Calm, professional. No hint in his recorded voice that anything would ever go wrong. By the second year, the hope had curdled into something else. Not acceptance. I wasn't ready to call it that, but a kind of exhausted suspension. I went to a grief support group for families of the missing, held on Wednesday evenings in a church basement that smelled of folding chairs and old coffee. The people there understood things that no one else did. That not knowing is its own species of grief. That you can mourn someone who may still be alive. That you can be furious at a person you're terrified for. I became furious at Daniel. I'm not ashamed of that now, though I was then. I was furious at him for the text message, for those 20 words that explained nothing and promised everything. Don't worry, as if worry were a faucet, as if a father could simply turn it off. By the third year, I had reorganized my life around the absence. I kept his old bedroom the way he'd left it, not as a shrine, but because I couldn't decide what else to do with it. His books were still on the shelf. Field guides, hydrology texts, a dog-eared copy of a novel I'd given him one Christmas that he'd apparently never gotten around to reading. I watered the small cactus on his windowsill every 2 weeks because I couldn't bring myself to let it die. Even though cacti are nearly impossible to kill, and this one would probably outlive me regardless. I retired from teaching high school biology in January of that third year. Not because of Daniel, I told myself, but because 31 years was enough and the pension was sufficient, and I was tired of other people's children needing things from me when my own child was somewhere I couldn't reach. I planted a vegetable garden. I read. I went for long, aimless drives on weekday afternoons, the kind that don't go anywhere specific, that just move. I was on one of those drives when I got the call from the detective assigned to Daniel's case, a weary, decent man named Hollowell who checked in every few months as a courtesy with nothing new to report. He called to tell me he was retiring, that the case would be transferred, that he was sorry he hadn't been able to give me answers. His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, and I thanked him with genuine warmth, because a cracked voice from a stranger is a rare and valuable thing. That was in March. The knock at my door came in October. It was a Wednesday evening. I remember because I'd been to the grief group earlier and come home feeling the particular hollow peace that those sessions sometimes produced, not happiness, but a temporary clearing, like fog burning off a field. I'd made soup. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book I wasn't really reading when the knock came. 3 knocks, firm, unhurried, not the knock of someone selling something or apologizing for a wrong address, a purposeful knock. I opened the door and saw a young woman I didn't recognize. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark, serious eyes and the kind of stillness in her face that belongs to people who have rehearsed a difficult conversation many times in their heads. She was wearing a plain gray jacket over a flannel shirt. She held a canvas bag against her side like it was something she intended to protect. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Yes." "My name is Renas Solis. I worked with your son." A pause, brief and careful. "I need to talk to you. I've been trying to find the right time for 3 years and I've run out of excuses to wait." I let her in. I made coffee neither of us drank. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten 10,000 meals since Daniel vanished. And she placed the canvas bag on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands and began. She had worked at Verdant Sciences for 2 years before Daniel disappeared. She'd been a junior analyst, newer than Daniel, quieter. They weren't close friends, she said, but they were good colleagues. They shared an office pod. They exchanged the low-grade pleasantries of people who spend their days in adjacent chairs. She knew he took his coffee black. She knew he had a photograph of me on his desk, a candid one from a camping trip years ago, me laughing at something off camera. She said she'd always liked that photo because Daniel seemed so proud of it, the way he'd positioned it. She paused at that, and I had to look at the table for a moment. In the weeks before he vanished, she continued, Daniel had been behaving differently. Nothing alarming, nothing she would have thought to report. He was staying late. He was quieter than usual. He was spending a lot of time on a specific county water study, longer than the project warranted. She'd assumed he was being thorough. Daniel was always thorough. Then, the Thursday before he disappeared, he came to her desk at the end of the day when the office was nearly empty and sat down across from her and said, very quietly, "Renee, if anything ever seems off, if anyone ever asks you about the Caldwell County samples, just tell them you didn't work on that project. Okay? It's not a big deal. I just need you to be careful." She'd been startled. She'd asked him what he meant. He'd smiled and said he was probably overthinking things and not to worry about it. "He said the same thing to me that he said to you," she told me. "Don't worry, I've thought about that a lot. I think it was what he said when he was worried." She reached into the canvas bag and produced a manila folder, thick with papers, and set it on the table between us. She'd kept it for 3 years. She'd wanted to go to the police, but she'd been afraid in a way she struggled to articulate, but that I understood the moment she began trying. The kind of afraid that has no clear shape. The kind that lives in the stomach, not the mind. Daniel had emailed her the folder contents the night he disappeared. A single email sent at 10:52 p.m., nearly an hour before he texted me. No subject line, no message in the body. Just an attachment. 6 months of water quality data from Caldwell County, annotated in Daniel's meticulous hand. I am not a water scientist. I spent 30 years teaching high school biology, and while I understand the principles involved, the specific language of the annotations was beyond me. But Renaa walked me through it, pointing at columns of numbers, at highlighted anomalies, at the notes Daniel had written in the margins in his small, careful print. What he'd found, what he believed he'd found, was evidence that a chemical company operating upstream in Caldwell County had been falsifying its discharge reports for years. The actual contamination levels in the water supply were significantly higher than what the company had been reporting to state regulators. Not catastrophically so, not the kind of thing that killed people outright, but the kind of slow, cumulative contamination that accumulates in bodies over decades, that shows up eventually in cancer rates and developmental disorders, and the quiet statistics that take years to interpret. He'd found it almost by accident, she explained. The county study was meant to be routine. He'd been cross-referencing the company's self-reported data with his own field samples, which he was only doing because he was Daniel, because Daniel cross-referenced everything, because thoroughness was as natural to him as breathing. He found it, I said. It was barely a question. He found it, she confirmed, and someone knew he found it. She didn't say he was murdered. She was careful not to say that, but she laid out what she knew with the quiet precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had given it 3 years of rehearsal, and what she knew was this. 3 days after Daniel disappeared, Greer, his supervisor, the lean, distracted man who'd spoken to the police, cleaned out Daniel's workstation. This was unusual. Standard protocol was to preserve a missing employee's materials. When Renaa quietly raised this with HR, she was told Greer had authorization. When she asked Greer directly, he said it was just procedure. Within 6 weeks, Greer had received a significant promotion. The Caldwell County project was quietly closed and reassigned to an outside firm. Its findings were never published. Renaa had done her own research in the years since, carefully, in the hours she could spare, in ways she hoped wouldn't draw attention. The chemical company, a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate, had significant local political connections. Its CEO sat on the board of a regional economic development authority. 2 of its senior officers had previously worked for the state environmental agency. She had gone to a lawyer once early on, and the lawyer had listened and then said, very carefully, that she would need significantly more evidence before anyone would be willing to take a case like this forward. That the connections involved were the kind that made cases disappear before they began. He'd used those words, disappear, and then looked briefly stricken and apologized. We sat at my kitchen table for a long time after she finished. The soup I'd made had gone cold on the stove. The coffee sat untouched. Outside, a car passed slowly down my street, its headlights sweeping across the curtains, and I watched the light move and felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly, but the thing that lives just beneath it. The thing that makes hope possible. "Why now?" I finally asked her. "Why did you come now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the canvas bag again and produced a single sheet of paper, a printout, and slid it across the table. It was a news article from a regional paper, dated 3 weeks earlier. A whistleblower at the chemical company, an internal accountant, had gone to federal regulators with evidence of financial fraud in the reporting systems. The investigation was early and tentative, but it was open. There were federal agents involved now. The kind of investigation that could, if it moved in the right direction, reach the environmental data that Daniel had found. "There are people inside now," Renaa said. "Federal people, people with more protection than a lawyer in this county. If we go to them with what Daniel found, with the timeline, with everything I've documented over 3 years," she stopped, steadied herself. "It won't bring him back. I know that. I'm not pretending it will, but it might tell us what happened, and it might mean that what he found actually means something." That he wasn't. Her voice broke briefly. She pulled it back. He was so careful, she said. He was so careful about everything. He deserves for it to have mattered. I held the folder in my hands after she left. She'd given me her number. She'd given me the name of a federal investigator she'd already contacted quietly, who had expressed willingness to hear what I had. She'd given me 3 years of her own careful documentation, dates, names, observations, compiled with a patience that humbled me. I sat with the folder until midnight. Then I went to Daniel's room and turned on the light and stood in the doorway the way I used to stand in his doorway when he was small, and I wanted to check that he was still there, still breathing, still safe in a world that hadn't yet shown him how unsafe it could be. The cactus on the windowsill was small and green and stubbornly alive. His books were on the shelf, his field guides, his hydrology texts, the unread novel from Christmas. On the shelf beside them, something I hadn't thought about in a long time, a cheap plastic trophy from a middle school science fair, the kind with a gold-painted figure on top and a little engraved plate on the base. First place, Environmental Science, Daniel Marsh. He'd been 13. He'd tested the water quality of 3 local streams and presented his findings on a trifled poster board with the seriousness of a doctoral candidate. His teacher had called me afterward to say she'd never seen a student that age so committed to getting the methodology right. I picked up the trophy. It was lighter than I remembered. He'd been doing the same thing at 29 that he'd been doing at 13, testing the water, cross-referencing the data, making sure the numbers were honest. The world had been the same world, just with higher stakes and fewer trifled poster boards. I called Renee the next morning at 8 o'clock, before I'd fully convinced myself I was ready. She answered on the second ring, as if she'd been expecting it. I told her I wanted to meet with the investigator. I told her I wanted to go through everything she'd compiled, start to finish, so I understood it as completely as possible before we walked into any room together. She said, "I've been ready for 3 years." I believed her. I don't know what happened to my son. I want to be honest about that. I don't know if Daniel is alive somewhere, living under a different name in a place where no one can find him, having made the calculation that disappearing was safer than staying. I don't know if he's dead. I don't know if he made it to that trail and kept walking for reasons I'll never understand, or if he was led there or carried there. I don't know what happened in the hours between his text to me and the moment his car was found. What I know is this: my son found something real. He documented it carefully, cross-referenced it thoroughly, emailed it to a colleague he trusted, and texted his father at 11:47 on a Tuesday night with the instinct, the parental instinct, even reversed to say don't worry. He didn't want me to worry. He thought he could handle it. He thought, as careful people often think, that being careful was enough. Maybe it was. Maybe he's out there, careful and alive, waiting for a moment that feels safe enough to come back from. I've learned not to foreclose that possibility. The grief group taught me that. Don't foreclose. Keep the door open, even when it costs you. The federal investigation moved slowly, the way federal investigations do. There were months of quiet. Then in the spring following Renee's visit, a subpoena landed on the chemical company's parent corporation. Then another. The regional paper ran a story. Then a larger outlet picked it up. The company's CEO resigned, citing health reasons, with the particular timing of a man who has been advised to stop making himself visible. Greer was interviewed by investigators. I don't know what he said. I'm not entitled to that information, not yet. But Hollowell, the retired detective, my retired detective, called me when he heard the news and he said, "I think things are moving, Richard." He'd never called me by my first name before. It felt like something. On the last Sunday of that spring, I was in the garden when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring twice, then answered. Silence on the line. Then breathing. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years and 4 months, rougher than I remembered, carrying something in it that I can only describe as the sound of a person who has survived something they didn't know how to survive. Dad. I sat down in the dirt between the tomato plants. I didn't plan to. My legs simply decided for me. Daniel, I said. My voice was very steady, which surprised me. All those years of not sleeping, of calling a voicemail in the dark, of standing at a window when unfamiliar cars passed, and when the moment arrived, my voice was steady. I suppose some part of me had been rehearsing too. I'm okay, he said. I've been okay, I'm sorry. Dad, I'm so sorry, I didn't know how to. His voice broke then, and I heard him pull a breath and steady himself the way I'd seen him steady himself as a boy after falls, after hard things. The exact same sound. 32 years old and still the same sound. Where are you? I asked. A pause, then, somewhere safe. I've been somewhere safe. I'll explain everything. I want to explain everything. Another pause. Are you okay? Did you? A woman named Renee came to see me, I said. Silence, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. She kept it, he finally said, and his voice had something in it that might have been a kind of awe. 3 years, she kept it. She did, I said. She kept everything. He came home 6 weeks later. I won't describe that moment in detail, because some things belong to the people who live them and no one else. I'll say only that he was thinner and quieter, and that he'd grown a beard he later shaved off because he said it made him feel like someone else. I'll say that we sat in the kitchen for most of 2 days, and he talked and I listened, and then I talked and he listened, and we ate soup and let the coffee go cold the same way I had with Renee. He'd been hiding. He was honest about it and ashamed of it in equal measure, and I told him, I want this on record, so to speak, that he had nothing to be ashamed of. He'd been 29 years old and he'd stumbled onto something that powerful people wanted to remain buried, and he'd made the terrified calculation that living quietly was better than not living at all. He'd been wrong about not contacting me. He knew that. He'd been wrong to leave me in that suspension for 3 years, and he knew that too, and the knowing was visible on him in a way I suspected would be visible for a long time. But he was home. He was alive. The cactus on his windowsill was still alive. Some things endure past all reasonable expectation. The last thing I'll tell you is this. A few months after Daniel came home, he went with me to the grief group. He'd asked to come. He sat in that church basement that smelled of folding chairs and old coffee, and he listened to the other people there, the ones still waiting, the ones still suspended. And afterward, in the parking lot, he stood by my car and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I didn't think about what it was like from the outside. I was so inside my own fear that I couldn't. I know, I said. I'm going to spend a long time making that right. I know that too. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked up at the October sky, the same season as Renee's knock. A year later, the air with that particular sharpness that autumn carries, and he said something that I've turned over many times since. The water is still there, he said. The contamination, even with the investigation, even with everything, the people who drank it for 20 years still drank it. You can't take that back. No, I agreed, you can't. So it has to mean something, the finding of it, the documentation, what Renee kept, what she came to you with. He looked at me. It has to mean something, or I don't know what any of it was for. I thought about a 13-year-old boy and a trifled poster board, and the seriousness of someone who understood, even then, that the numbers had to be honest. I thought about 20 words on a phone screen at 11:47 p.m. I thought about a woman holding a canvas bag against her side like it was something worth protecting, and 3 years of quiet, careful work, and a federal investigation that was, slowly, imperfectly, the way justice always moves, doing the thing that justice is supposed to do. It already means something, I said. You already made it mean something, the minute you noticed and wrote it down. He didn't answer that, but he put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way men do when words are used up, and we stood there in the parking lot in the October cold until we were ready to go home. He calls every Sunday, without fail. I don't take that for granted anymore. I don't take anything for granted anymore. Not the cactus, not the soup going cold, not the particular quality of silence in a house that is waiting for something it doesn't know how to name. But I take the Sundays. I hold on to them. I let them matter as much as they do. That's all any of us can do, I think. Notice what's there, write it down, make sure the numbers are honest. And answer when someone knocks.